Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Catalyzing Change by Supporting Embedded Expertise, which is sponsored by the HIBAR Research Alliance, also known as the HRA. I'm Scott Slovic from the University of Idaho, and I'll be the moderator for today's one-hour event featuring Professors Andrea Fulmer-Greenhoot and Caroline Bennett from the University of Kansas, who are both leaders of the Trestle Project, which brings together researchers and practitioners to transform education and stimulate teaching and learning excellence. This is the 17th webinar in our series of presentations for researchers, research administrators, and others who are interested in what we call highly integrative, basic, and responsive research. Our previous webinars are now available for viewing at hibar-research.org. Now let me explain the structure of today's meeting. We'll begin with a brief overview of the HRA research, or the HIBAR research concept by HRA Director Lauren Whitehead. Andrea Fulmer-Greenhoot and Caroline Bennett will then speak about the Trestle Project's efforts to transform post-secondary instructional methods with a particular focus on catalyzing academic culture change, a core aspect of what the HIBAR Research Alliance is concerned with. And we'll then have approximately 20 minutes for Q&A, followed by an opportunity for our presenters to offer a few final messages. Now let's get started. Dr. Lauren Whitehead, the director of the HRA, is a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of British Columbia. He'll briefly introduce the concept of HIBAR research and the HRA organization.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to have just a brief opportunity to help set a context for the upcoming very interesting presentations from Dia and Caroline. I'd like just to give some background on the HIBAR Research Alliance, and specifically just to address the question, what is a HIBAR research project? So HIBAR research projects are characterized by embracing two key dualities. This is going to sound a little bit logical, but it's, I think, a necessary clarification. The first of those dualities is integrating academic purpose and societal purpose, by which we mean that in order to discover needed new knowledge, we have to apply it to solve real world problems. So this is a key aspect in achieving the combination of academic purpose and societal purpose. The second duality, if you like, is integrating academic leadership and societal leadership, the people who are running a HIBAR project. And the purpose there is to establish the cognitive diversity that is essential for the leaders to succeed in the goals of the project. So these are four very important ideas. They're at the core of HIBAR research projects. And they're so important that I think they deserve a diagram. So let's take those four ideas and place them in a chart here. And I'll add that this term HIBAR that we use to label these projects, we use it because there is no single word that means a research project that contains all four of these key aspects. So that's where we use it. And it came from about 5 years ago at Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, where a bunch of research leaders came together and tried to come up with just some word that would describe that. And they noticed that there's a lot of integration going on between the left side and the right side of this diagram. And so that's where the words highly integrative were suggested. And it's basic researchy on the left, and it's responsive to societal need on the right. And so that's where the words basic and responsive came from, hence the acronym HIBAR. It's just a word, though. It's a word that describes, or labels, I should say, this very specific kind of research project. Now, the key thing about these projects, or there are two key things, actually, that drive what we'll be talking about today. The first one is that the projects, any individual HIBAR research project is narrowly defined. So and in general, it's a very narrow category of research. We estimate maybe about 5% of research projects at universities today have that combination of those four characters simultaneously. Depends on the department, of course. But roughly speaking, it's not that common, but it is very impactful work. History has shown that HIBAR research projects, and they've been around for a very long time, they have been traditionally very impactful, generating Nobel Prizes, solving major problems. They've attracted a great deal of attention and interest. They're fantastic. So, and there's room to do more because they're not that common. So that's why the HIBAR Research Alliance was formed. It was a group of people, and now it's grown over the years, that is dedicated, organized and dedicated to and united in the support of HIBAR research projects. We aim together to increase the rate of HIBAR research projects from about 1 project in 20 at universities today to about 1 in 5 by 2030, while improving all kinds of research. This will help universities respond more effectively to societal needs while increasing the overall excellence of their diverse research portfolios. Now, our presentation today focuses on a truly immense social challenge or societal challenge. How can higher education become much more effective with the limited funds available? The University of Kansas is leading a bold project with a HIBAR approach. The problem is this: better teaching methods, which are known, are often underapplied due to a kind of cultural inertia. So that's the challenge. And the Transforming Education, Stimulating Teaching and Learning Excellence, or TRESSL, is a project that organizes department-level interventions to cause the significant organizational culture change needed for success. It's a lot of words. This will all be much clearer when you actually hear the presentation. The research project itself is a collaboration of 7 universities and is generating and applying new knowledge that will help accelerate these advances throughout the university system, leading to many transformed undergraduate courses that enable greatly improved undergraduate learning outcomes. Well, I'm really looking forward to the presentation by Dia and Caroline. I can't wait to get to it. And on that note, Scott, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. That was a very helpful overview. And just when I think you can't refine your introduction to HIBAR further, you always manage to do so with more precise details and more colors and interesting new wrinkles in your diagram. So thank you very much. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters. Dr. Andrea Fulmer-Greenhood, who, as you heard, goes by Dia, is Professor of Psychology, Director of the Center for Teaching Excellence, and Gott Teaching Scholar at the University of Kansas. Dia also serves as Director of the Bayview Alliance and is Principal Investigator of the BVA's TRESSL project. And Dr. Caroline Bennett is Professor of Civil, Environmental, and Architectural Engineering and Dean R. and Florence W. Frisbee Associate Chair of Graduate Studies at the University of Kansas. She also serves as a campus leader for the TRESSL project. Dia and Caroline, welcome.
Thank you. I am going to start us off and give you an overview of this project, what inspired it, and some of the approaches that we've taken. And then I'm going to hand it over to Caroline to talk a little bit more about our researcher, societal leader / practitioner partnership and how that has led to ongoing improvements in this effort. So the goal of this webinar is really to use this TRESSL initiative to illustrate how researcher practitioner partnerships can be used to transform teaching and learning at institutions of higher education. And as you already heard from Lauren, we're going to focus on this initiative that we call TRESSL, which stands for Transforming Education, Stimulating Teaching and Learning Excellence, which was a collaboration of 7 research universities in the US and Canada. It was a collaboration that was fostered by the Bayview Alliance, which is another alliance of universities that are collaborating on methods, developing and testing strategies for promoting change in undergraduate education. This is an effort, the primary intervention took place between 2015 and 2019, and then we've had a sort of extensive measurement phase where we have been looking at the downstream impact of the changes that we implemented. And this was a project that has been funded by the National Science Foundation, as you'll see on the bottom right corner of the slide there. So I want to start by saying a little bit more about the problem that we were trying to solve in Trestle. And Lauren already gave a little bit of background on this, so I really appreciate the setup. That will help deepen understanding here. So we were trying to respond to a number of drivers for transforming undergraduate education. And these drivers have really been multiplying over the last decade or more. And the first of those is advances in what is known about learning that essentially illustrates that active learning and collaborative learning are far more effective in most educational settings than just asking students to listen to a lecture. So this comes out of decades of research in cognitive science and cognitive development, as well as hundreds of demonstrations in the classroom. And I've shared on the right of this slide a graphic that comes out of a meta-analysis of this work that showed out of 225 studies, this overall trend that active learning reduces the likelihood of an unsuccessful course completion, the grade of a D, an F, or a withdraw. And I will also add that since then, a second meta-analysis illustrated that active learning improves equity in student outcomes as well. So it can be a major driver in eliminating or reducing achievement gaps. At the same time, there are a number of societal drivers that have been pushing for the transformation of undergraduate education. One is just shifting beliefs about what teaching is, especially driven by the rapidly changing technology that's available to enhance our teaching or facilitate teaching. We've had significant demographic changes in who is going to college. There are shifts in workforce needs, and then a range of societal demands, both in terms of the expectations that the public has for higher education, that if a student is paying for an education, that we should do all that we can to make sure that they're successful in achieving that, as well as issues like science denial, which have really become elevated in our society over the last several years. So this is the kind of the background. In addition, I want to point out that the efficacy of student-centered active learning approaches really isn't controversial, and I'm going to share just two indicators of that. One is if you look at the structure and initiatives of the National Science Foundation. They have a division of undergraduate education, and within that, they have an institutional transformation track in their funding opportunities, which is intentionally designed to support these kinds of projects. How do we get these methods more broadly put into action? In addition, broader impacts and educational plans, there's a greater expectation that those result in meaningful educational changes. Another indication that I'll mention is the Association of American Universities, over 10 years ago now, developed an initiative that they called the Undergraduate STEM Education Improvement Initiative, and a network around that in response to this accumulating evidence that that was actually being, produced by many AAU institutions that were showing that these insights were not being implemented on the AAU campuses. So, and many more other indications of how this is really not a controversial thing anymore. But nevertheless, these methods are still not the norm in university classrooms. And a paper by Marilyn Staines and a number of other colleagues came out in Science in 2018. They aggregated classroom observations of over 2,000 classes at 26 doctoral universities. And in those analyses, they showed that the vast majority of class time was still being spent on lecture, and with students spending almost 90% of the time in class just listening, as opposed to actively engaging with the material. They also, on the right side of this graph, you'll see they did some analyses to categorize different classes into different teaching styles. And the majority of classes were categorized as didactic, a smaller number as interactive lectures. So mostly information delivery with a little bit of questioning and back and forth with students. And then a much smaller number, less than 1/5, were really student-centered and meaningfully implementing these better methods. So what's the problem here? Why aren't these things being used on university campuses? Lauren already mentioned that this is really an issue of institutional and cultural change. This is a big problem, and we have a huge ship to turn around here. In addition to that, there are just a lot of barriers. So here are some of the common ones that come out in the literature. Not all faculty are aware of the practices or how to implement them. There aren't often incentives or time provided for making changes and making improvements. And then there are some individuals who have tried the methods, but very often they don't go smoothly the first time around and might need a little bit more scaffolding to really see an impact. So the Trestle Initiative is designed with these issues in mind. We wanted to design and implement an intervention that would promote widespread faculty adoption of these better teaching practices that we know can improve learning and eliminate disparities for minoritized students. We also, at the same time that we wanted to make a change on our campuses, we wanted to advance our understanding of how to accomplish such a change by studying the impact of this intervention model that we designed at multiple institutions. So to figure out what to do, we turned to the change literature, because fortunately there is quite a bit of research now in both the higher education context and other contexts that can be drawn upon for developing strategies for institutional change. So here on this slide are some of the literatures that we drew upon. So research on the adoption of evidence-based pedagogy in STEM, the scholarship of teaching and learning, and a pretty extensive literature on faculty development. And then outside of education, we drew on lessons from the improvement science literature, specifically the principles of networked improvement communities. On the right side of the slide is a synthesizing framework that is very, very broadly used now as a grounding for change work on university campuses. And it seeks to bring some organization to the range of strategies that have been utilized. I'm actually going to skip to the next slide and just share with you some key takeaways from our synthesis of this literature as we were designing the intervention. Essentially, some of the things that we saw were that effective approaches generally include multiple strategies that are operating at multiple levels of the higher ed system. So both supporting individual change and structural or environmental change. Another really big one was the need to support faculty agency so that the work, the change is being carried out with them instead of being done to them. Also, the need to engage leadership and create support structures to provide pedagogical resources and data, opportunities for reflective practice by instructors, social support, particularly when you have people trying to do something new. This is really important. Fostering a shared vision around the change and new norms that would support and sustain the change. And then finally, measuring and reflecting on what we're seeing for continuous improvement. So And I want to just highlight before I go into the actual intervention model, um, the idea of centering faculty agency. This was really core to our approach. And I think this is where you really see the value of the researcher practitioner partnership. So in our approach, we centered faculty agency and partnered researchers and scholars of systemic change with practitioners. And in this case, the practitioners were faculty leaders who themselves were trying to make changes happen in their own departments or their schools. And Caroline represents one of those individuals. And so we'll get to hear more from her in just a bit about how we work together. But we strove to create a bi-directional system so that the research on institutional change would inform the intervention, but at the same time, that what we were doing was deeply informed by practitioner observations and insights. So here is an overview of how the literature informed the way we designed the intervention model in the Trestle Initiative. So the model had three core components, and the first of these is the idea of department embedded expertise. This was an idea that was adapted from the Science Education Initiative that was implemented at the University of British Columbia. It was a very successful intervention in which teaching postdoctoral fellows and other pedagogy experts were embedded in academic departments to collaborate with other faculty on the redesign of courses with better teaching methods. This is a method that provides the support structures that faculty need. It helps relieve some of the time and effort that's required of making a change, provides some practical support, pedagogical knowledge and resources, and so on. And so on the left side, in the blue, we've highlighted the change principles that informed this component. And on the right side is what it looked like in practice, because each institution implemented a variation on this idea. So at some institutions, we had postdocs. At other institutions, we had faculty leaders. And again, this provided faculty with more time to collaborate on change. A second component is community building. And the community building took place at multiple levels. So department level working groups organized around the courses that were being transformed. We also had university-wide consortia that would bring attention to this course transformation initiative. And then we formed a community across the 7 institutions that we called the Trestle Network as another forum for idea sharing, social support, disseminating pedagogical resources, and more. And then the third component was to collect evidence and to make it visible. So this is a strategy that really was designed to promote reflective practice, to drive measurement for continuous improvement. We implemented this, or the form that this took was we created a number of occasions and mechanisms for the faculty leaders to share the strategies that they were using, as well as the impact that it was having on student learning. This created an occasion for them to actually assess the impact, to reflect on that, and then to produce some sort of public documentation that others had an opportunity to learn from. And in that sense, it helped to shift social norms and really foster a shared vision across the various communities in which they were shared. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Caroline, who's going to talk more about how our intervention was not static, but rather was continuously improved as a result of practitioner insights.
Thanks, Dia, and hi, everyone. Yeah, Yeah, I'd like to start by describing a little bit of context for how I, as a practitioner, was situated within the Trestle initiative. So I was a co-I on the project, so I had very regular meetings with the rest of the project leadership, but I was also responsible for rolling out a lot of the change programming and overseeing how that worked in the School of Engineering here at the University of Kansas. So as part of that, I was working on building a community within the school, and I also was supervising our postdoctoral teaching fellows who are our embedded experts working on Trestle at KU. So this really situated me to be able to understand in real time how things were working, what the pinch points were in terms of the intervention, and where there might be areas that were kind of ripe for iteration. What I'd like to do is kind of walk you through a short series of vignettes. And each of these is a little example of where we saw needs kind of emerging, where we thought there might be an area where iteration would be helpful, and how we connected that with information from the change literature to come to an action to improve the effectiveness of the Trestle program. So the first example is as faculty started working on course transformation, there were lots of questions. You know, people are looking around and wondering how others on campus have made this happen in an effective way. So in short, to borrow a term from our good colleague Dan Bernstein, they were looking for prototypes. When we talked about this within the leadership group, we were able to connect this with a lot of the insights from the change literature. This was an opportunity for us to not only provide prototypes, but also to connect faculty and embedded experts with pedagogical resources and examples, and it also could serve as a prompt for measurement of improvement. And so our action was to develop a really comprehensive website for Trestle, trestlenetwork.ku.edu. It has lots of case studies, examples of different course transformation activities that are very rich. It shows different methods for how assessment was done, what types of measurements could be taken across a course transformation, and also provided resources for how you could actually work to take those measures. The next little example is focused on using COPUS data as a change lever. Now, COPUS is just a tool for measuring exactly what is happening in a class at any given time. So we use this as part of our one of our measurement tools across Trestle to understand what changes were happening in terms of course transformation across the different institutions that were a part of Trestle. So faculty naturally wanted to see the summaries of the data that was collected from the courses that they were responsible for teaching. And it turned out that when we provided faculty with those data, it gave us an opportunity to prompt faculty to engage in reflective practices, and also gave us a lever to further engage them with some of the theory and ideas behind what was working and what might not have been working in the way they anticipated. And so this led to a connection between our embedded experts, so the faculty working with the class, and at KU, or postdoctoral teaching fellows, to have this really rich discussion about the data that was collected for their courses. And in some cases, that discussion prompted a great deal of further change. You know, faculty would say, wow, this really doesn't look the way that I expected. I expected to see a lot more of my time in class being captured with active learning activities. You know, how can I change the way that this report looks? So it turned out to be a really important set of insights and levers for us from a change perspective. Okay, the next example is focused on collaborative undergraduate teaching fellow training sessions. As part of the Trestle project, we had a series of annual network meetings, cross-institutional network meetings. And at one of them, we learned about this great learning assistant program that was unfolding at the University of Colorado Boulder. And so at KU, we wanted to adopt a program like that. And it grew very, very rapidly, actually, at the University of Kansas. And so there was this emergent need that we needed to provide some sort of formalized training for our undergraduate teaching fellows. And this was happening in multiple departments. So stepping back, as myself and other faculty leaders recognized this need, we talked about this in the context of the change literature being an opportunity to prompt reflection on how UGTFs and learning assistants were being used, how we might use this as a lever to further disseminate best practices and evidence-based practices in terms of teaching. And then also, it's an opportunity to build a shared vision across different units on campus. And so as part of this, we developed a collaborative cross-departmental training and kickoff program that involved multiple departments at the University of Kansas. And then the last case study I want to share was a need that became obvious, that multiple programs being offered through the Center for Teaching Excellence, which DIA directs, for participants in that to have motivation for more accountability, to share out their work, to make that visible, and also as a lever to prompt reflection and measurement. So in this example, DIA is actually the practitioner in this case. And so the insight that came from these observations was that this was an opportunity to shape social norms, to disseminate pedagogical knowledge and data, and to incorporate and make visible support from leadership across the university. The photo on the right actually includes our chancellor, who was participating in the celebration of teaching, and this was the change that was implemented. We had always had a poster symposium, and instead it was morphed into a much broader, more impactful celebration of teaching that included our high-level administrators at KU. Okay. So those are 4 different case studies of how we worked to integrate research and practitioners across the Trestle project. Now I'd like to provide a little summary of some of our measures of impact across the project. And so we've got these categorized into 4 different constructs. We looked at measures for course transformation activity. That is kind of by the numbers. How many courses did we impact? How many faculty and departments were involved? What did the changes actually look like? We also looked at use of evidence-based practices. So I already talked a little bit about our use of classroom observation tools, that COPUS measurement. We also solicited self-reports using the teaching practices inventory. And then we considered departmental teaching culture and climate by distributing a survey for department climate for change and longitudinal departmental case studies. And then lastly, we looked at measures of student learning and success. Faculty and departments were responsible for considering learning gains that happened at the course level. And at the project level, we considered course distributions and changes in percents of Ds, Fs, and withdrawals of students enrolled in courses that were transformed or targeted for transformation versus those that weren't. All right, so let's take a look at some of those numbers. So this chart is pretty data rich. It's showing changes in the involvement of numbers of departments over years of intervention in the project. So each of the colors is representative of a year in the project. It's also showing the cumulative addition of the number of courses that were targeted for course transformation work, and then the number of faculty members who were involved in the project and in this effort. So you see a pretty significant amount of growth across the 4 project years in terms of the number of courses and faculty that were engaged with the work. And the number of departments is a smaller number because there's fewer departments on each campus. But really, we tended to kind of max out the number of departments who could be involved in the project at a pretty early stage. And over the course of the project, we impacted nearly 180 courses, and 190 faculty members were involved in the work. So a lot of the changes that we're focused on, including formalizing learning outcomes within courses, formalizing assessments and improving those and how they are aligned with learning outcomes, working on course structure, identifying and dealing with bottlenecks to student learning, and then incorporating greater amounts of active and collaborative learning. Okay, so this is a really interesting set of data that was distilled from our COPUS measurements. So I want to start by focusing on the comparison in the left plot. So this is a comparison of courses that were targeted for course transformation in green versus courses that weren't targeted for course transformation in blue. And the data that we're comparing here are cases where the instructor was primarily presenting versus the students working. Or you can think about this: how much time in a given class was the instructor presenting versus were the students working on some task. And you can see that across the project, the targeted courses saw a really significant increase in the amount of time that students were working relative to the comparison courses, and smaller levels of time devoted to the instructor presenting than the comparison courses. And this is also reflected in the teaching style. And here we're using similar terminology as Dia introduced relative to the Staines et al. Paper from 2018 in Science. And we saw large increases in student-centered teaching styles in our targeted courses, as well as increases in our interactive lecture focus in terms of teaching style relative to the comparison courses, and less of a focus in our targeted courses on didactic teaching styles. And the differences here between targeted comparison courses are even greater for our data than they were in the Staines paper. All right, I mentioned that we also had a series of longitudinal measurements across the length of the project. Pat Hutchings and Mary Huber focused on 4 different departments: Earth Sciences at the University of British Columbia, Biology at KU, Physics at Queen's University, and Computer Science at Indiana University, Bloomington. And these happened between 2013 and 2020. 3 different sets of interviews and data were collected to form a baseline, a mid-project capture, and then a final capture. And so in terms of a big picture summary, these case studies revealed that there were really significant positive changes in departmental teaching culture, focused around how transformed courses were being viewed and implemented, that departments were having more robust conversations and showing new ways of thinking about teaching, and that there were more embedded expertise implemented over time. And then the other key takeaway was that the Trestle network-wide activities fostered a spirit of collaboration and trust that wasn't present before. So participants really valued being a part of the network. They really valued being able to translate ideas from one institution or one department to another. And participants also valued being part of something larger. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Dia to wrap this up with some impact.
Great. So I'm just going to wrap us up with a few of the lessons that we've taken away from this work that I think relate to some of the interests of the HIBAR network. So first and foremost, I think that our data are showing that the Trestle model really has been effective in addressing this problem of how to promote broad uptake of more effective teaching practices in departments. And we did this through the translation of institutional change research into practice. And it actually helped us design not only an effective intervention, but what I didn't mention previously was that the original embedded expert model at UBC was extremely expensive relative to what we implemented at the other institutions that were a part of Trestle. And so we were able to identify ways to do something similar at a far lower cost. Another thing was we really tried to treat every implementation challenge, every time we felt we were running into a wall, into a new problem to be solved. And when we hit that wall, we saw it as an opportunity to just revisit the principles from the change literature. So that really was our grounding throughout. Finally, the partnership between researchers of institutional change and the practitioners of these principles really helped us to create a nimble approach so that we were able to engage in rapid practice-informed improvements to the intervention and therefore its impact. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Scott, who I think is going to moderate questions for us, and I will stop the share.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dia and Caroline. That was quite a fascinating and powerfully presented body of information about various aspects, from the fundamental pedagogical issues of different types of instruction and learning to the broader cultural processes and impacts at academic institutions. So we do have some seated questions on a broader level that we'd like to begin with, as people who are in the audience may start to share some of their own responses and questions that occurred to them. One initial question is whether you see any demographic trends, for example, age, among faculty who were enthusiastically engaged in the course transformation efforts, and do these trends or the absence of such trends offer any insights about strategies for universities to catalyze academic change?
We did see some demographic trends, at least in terms of the faculty who participated in the survey. So we had faculty who were, we divided the faculty into three groups. We had those who were involved in the intervention. So they were Trestle active, we called them. And then we had another group that were in the same department, but not Trestle active. And then we had a third group that was a kind of a randomly selected sample from across the campus. And when you compared the within department, the two within department groups, the Trestle active and the within department comparison, the Trestle active group was more junior, so earlier career for sure. That said, I think Caroline and I can both think of several examples of senior faculty who jumped on board and were actually invigorated by the change and, kind of rejuvenated in their approach to teaching. So I really hate to say you just engage the mid and early career faculty, because I don't think that's true. I just think we have to recognize that it might be an easier on-ramp, a gentler on-ramp for early and mid-career faculty than for those who, the more senior you are, the more undoing you have to do to make a change. And that's hard.
Thank you. Here's a much more specific question that's related to the Trestle, either the BVA or more specifically the Trestle website, about how to measure improvements in different types of pedagogy. And is there a survey that specifically shows how these improvements were measured, and where would it be on your website if it is there?
So one of the measures we used were those classroom observations, so that we had fairly objective analysis of what was actually happening in the classroom. And that actually, we have extensive training and tools on how to use that observation tool on our website. It's very widely used. It was also the tool used in the science paper by Staines et al. That I referenced at the beginning of the talk. We also used a self-report inventory that asked faculty to indicate what kinds of practices they were using. I'm not sure if we have that on our website. I will say we saw fewer dramatic differences in that than we do in the actual observations. So I think the observations are a more precise indicator of the changes than the self-report tool. Caroline, anything I'm forgetting?
I mean, those are all the measures for capturing exactly what was happening in class. In terms of measuring like the outcomes, we also looked at grade distributions in courses. So we made a little reference to tracking rates of D's, F's, and W's, trying to compare those across a course that had been targeted for transformation versus a course that was very similar to it that hadn't been targeted for transformation, and to try and understand the impact in terms of student success.
Thank you. Here's a question from one of our attendees about exactly what is taught in undergraduate education. The question is, learning about basic research skills is often not an explicit learning goal in undergraduate education, yet research skills are valuable, transferable skills in work and life. But most students don't know enough on this aspect, in my experience as our attendee in teaching social science subjects. Do you think it's a good idea to have research training as a specific goal in most college courses? And I wonder if this ties in with the issue of active learning, research training. I guess it's why science courses have traditionally had lab components as well as the the broader lecture components. Maybe the lab is where the active learning has been expected to take place, as opposed to listening to lectures. So what about the actual explicit instruction in research skills? And I find myself wondering too, in listening to the both of you, whether, because the HRA is so concerned with inspiring HIBAR type research in the future, whether students who've been exposed to active learning in the kinds of innovative courses that you're describing in this presentation, whether such students are better able or somehow more predisposed to be interested in the kinds of cross-sectoral entrepreneurial interactions that are part of HIBAR, and whether this improved educational structure might actually support the HIBAR initiative as well in that sense. So that's a lot packed in there, but if you can follow any of it, maybe you have some thoughts in response.
Caroline, do you want to start, and then I could follow if I have anything to add?
I'll try. I was going to defer to the social scientist. I don't know. I mean, I think it really depends on the course and what the specific goals of a course are. You know, in the courses that I work closely with in engineering, we have specific things for specific courses that we are counting on as outcomes from those courses. And some of them might include having some proficiency in research skills, and others just don't. I think it's probably important in most STEM fields to have that addressed at some curricular level, but probably not necessarily in every course. And it depends a lot on, you know, how closely research is integrated into the particular discipline. Anyways, so I'll pass it over to Dia.
And I would just say, you know, undergraduate research, involvement in undergraduate research is a well-known high impact practice in education that, you know, when students participate in undergraduate research, they tend to show higher levels of success overall in their degree program. And so big picture, I think that the more students can learn and have the opportunity to engage with research in the field that they've chosen, the better. But back to a point Caroline made, I think it can be sort of distributed, and also we could think about it developmentally. So, you know, if in a way, it would be difficult for students to acquire a really deep understanding of a discipline if they didn't have an understanding of where the knowledge in that discipline comes from, right? So, but it may be that you address that at different levels in different courses. So in my, freshman courses, I'm just helping my students understand what empirical research is and how to identify it and how to use research findings to draw conclusions about something in the real world. As they get further along in their program, then we might work more on how you would, utilize some of these methods yourself. So I would say, I think it's a great idea to embed some attention to the scholarship, the modes of scholarship in a discipline in a college course, but the way you do that might depend on where it is in the curriculum and its function in the curriculum.
Thank you. Thank you. So you referred to the Bayview Alliance and this consortium of 7 universities that have been collaborating on this project. And I wonder if you have some thoughts about whether Tressel's institutional change effort has benefited specifically from the fact that you have multiple universities working together on this. And then as a result of communicating with your partners and your colleagues at the various universities, have you determined that certain organizational structures or cultures at the various universities, as they differ, either better enable institutional change efforts or somehow impede those efforts?
That is a great and very rich question. So I would say absolutely, the Bayview Alliance enabled us on all of our campuses to do things that we could not have done alone as an institution alone. So there's so many ways in which it was a catalyst and a support. One is the idea of embedded expertise traveled from UBC to KU by virtue of the Bayview Alliance. So just the initial spark for the intervention. And then, so it provides an opportunity for a lot of idea exchange. And then we were able to create a broader network of change agents, of faculty that could connect with one another for social support, and again, for ideas to be shared across the network. And then, and also it gives a sense of legitimacy to the work that we might not have had if we were doing the work alone. So to be able to say, look, University of Colorado is also doing this project, and and so that's compelling for academic leaders. It's also compelling for faculty members who might be able to connect with somebody in their discipline at another institution. And then scientifically, it's been extremely valuable because, as you mentioned, Scott, we've been able to the way that we implemented the intervention was really sensitive to local context. So we made adaptations on each campus to fit where each campus was in their kind of change work and what infrastructure we had available, et cetera. And that enabled us to learn, I think, a lot about what works under what conditions. As far as, what's optimal, I think one of the things that Caroline and I would probably both agree on are that it's really helpful for the initiative to be situated in a unit that has broad reach to the faculty, and that so when there was a center that and led by a set of individuals that have some leadership capacity or leadership role at the institution, but also an ability to connect the initiative with other related initiatives. So at KU, for example, we were able to align several other things that we were doing out of the teaching center with what was going on in Trestle. And that synergy really enabled us to boost the impact. Caroline, is there anything else you would want to add?
I think that's a great capture. I agree.
So you're referring not to a discipline specific center necessarily, but to when you say a broader reach, you're thinking of a teaching excellence kind of center, or something. Could be a research excellence center that is broader than a single discipline.
Right. And it could be, like University of British Columbia, for example, had what they called SEI Central. So they had a central unit that so it doesn't have to be discipline free necessarily, or full, like our center supports the entire university, but it could be a STEM center, for example. But yes, I think something that's sort of external, but and has other activities that are adjacent that are going on, and reach into other areas of the university can really deepen the impact.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Well, we have about 2.5 minutes before the top of the hour. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back to you, Dia and Caroline, to offer any final messages. I realize you embedded those to some extent in your actual presentation, but maybe you'd like to reiterate and emphasize just a few of your key points before we conclude.
Caroline, anything you want to say?
Sure. I just say, we found an iterative approach to be so powerful throughout Trestle. And one of the reasons that it worked in our context was not only because we had the presence of, the researcher and the practitioner side, but also because of how connected they were in the project, that was structurally very connected. That was always intended to be the case from the initial conceiving of the project. So I think that's a really important takeaway, is that's part of what enabled that iterative approach.
Yeah, and I guess I would just really underscore that I think one of the things that made this initiative effective was that deep partnership between scholars who were really interested in change and promoting and studying change, and scholars who were on the ground making that change happen. And that without that synergy between the two, I don't think that we would have been able to get this work done. And I just think it really speaks to the value of translational work, that we can be, somebody can be studying change without actually making change happen. And so the researcher practitioner partnership is really key. And actually, for the last thing, I'm going to just pull up a slide, speaking of partnerships, and just acknowledge our supporters and our collaborators, and the Bayview Alliance, which I think we're all also instrumental in making this work happen.
Well, thank you both very much, Dia and Caroline. Trestle is obviously impressive in its own right, but it's a very interesting model for efforts like the HIBAR research effort. So I think it was really valuable to listen to you today. Thanks to all of our attendees for joining us, and please stay tuned for announcements of further events in this webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.